Greg Albo is a professor of political economy at York University, co-editor of the Socialist Register, the recent volume being Transforming Classes, and director of the Center for Social Justice.
I initially want to just start by thanking Lana Panche and John Charkey, where he is, for helping organize this series that we've had over the winter and into the beginning of the summer. As Lana was pointing out, we've covered a lot of issues in terms of tar sands, First Nations, urban ecology, cap and trade, and so on. I think it also gave us a chance to look back and think about the legacy of a lot of the ecological struggles we've undertaken since the late 1970s around acid rain, for example, the extension of the parks and conservation systems, the linking that was made in the 1980s between military production and ecological issues during the Second Cold War, the campaigns to defend the old growth forest, particularly the Temagami struggle and Clayoquot Sound. Also the various attempts that have occurred to build green work alliances inside the union movement, something that Nilafort just alluded to a bit. And of course, how these have interlaced with First Nations struggles, not only in the past, but particularly the way that they're with the upsurge of First Nations struggles as a whole, the way that they're completely interacting with ecological struggles right now in Canada. I think this has allowed us kind of to reflect on a couple of kind of key themes that are very important to think about when we're trying to assess the political situation and the building of alternatives in Canada right now. I think one of the first is just what we've discussed is the pressures that are faced from ecological contradictions right now in Canada but globally. Obviously, the main one that we're confronting is, of course, the 2% 2-degree rise in temperatures to ward off a sharp turning point from global warming. Constraint that's usually discussed of hitting 2040 to 2050, so it means a lot of steps right now to address the greenhouse gas reductions. The other is that all those things that we've been thinking about and debating about the Anthropocene epoch or the 6th great extinction or the irreversible desertification that has been occurring. Also some of the things that we've been dealing with, the ecological impacts in our own bodies, from toxics, etc., and the eco-biopolitics question. And finally, also something that Nilafort just spoke about, the unequal distribution of the consequences of ecological contradictions, the way they fall in poorer regions, the way they're falling on the Indigenous peoples, the question of environmental racism, and of course the way that they unequally impact on workers and peasants around the world and working class communities in Canada in particular. In Canada, I think at this moment there is quite strong ecological contradictions emerging from the type of developmental model that we've had in Canada historically. Some of this was, of course, the last couple of years because of the general weakness of growth in the global economy. It's been less apparent, but we have been on a 20, 30-year wave of a commodities boom. This commodities boom has obviously dramatically impacted Canada. It's been part of the turn to extreme energy production, from the St. Lawrence to the offshore to the far north, to oil sands production. So it's kind of hitting all regions of Canada in these forms of extreme energy production. It's also the way that the boundaries and borders of the extractive industries have been shifting in the north. In the pursuit of gold, diamonds, all kinds of precious metals, the big fight that's still going on over the control of the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario. But it's a similar struggle in all the Northern Territories across the country from that. One of the things that has occurred over the last year is that we haven't been able to reverse the pressures on the boreal forest. Right? The other great part of the Earth's lungs is the boreal forest, and we've done almost nothing to reverse the steady destruction of that. Some reports over the last 4 years have been reporting that the forestry destruction in the world is now the worst in the boreal forest. The demographic pressures and the form of our model of development, where we're so reliant on growing the size of the market and the extractive industries. And then when you look at the political terrain around this in Canada, it is very dismal. The political balance of forces in the electoral arena are doing almost nothing to reverse this. All the pressures, whatever the complexion of the government in power has been pushing in the other direction to reliance more on resource extraction, following the direction of the commodities boom. Canada has been a renegade on these issues in terms of whatever the limits of the Kyoto Accord around the international environmental agreements. We've cut back our environmental departments and regulation to probably the most extreme of any of the advanced capitalist countries, and those budgets now are largely at the levels they were in the late 1980s, early 1990s. You saw during the anti-crisis measures in 2008 to 2010, 2011, how hopeless our state capacity is right now to spend in the right direction around ecological issues. Rather than being able to put in place a lot of green transportation or energy conversion projects, during that kind of moment of expenditure offset the crisis, we were largely building hockey rinks. The big toilets for what's his name up around Algonquin Park. What's his name? The minister for that area. Clement, Tony, Big Tony. Yeah, up there. Yeah, exactly. That kind of expenditure. There's a lot of kind of pressures inside Canada around these issues. I think the other theme that came across in a lot of our discussions was the delusions of green growth, or the dematerialization that could occur inside capitalist economies. This is the illusory premises that we could kind of be consistent with the neoliberal policy regime and address ecological issues. We could just have to price in ecological externalities, whether it's greenhouse gases or pollutants, and that would form the basis for ecological solutions. The Kyoto Accord itself is a feature of this, right? Its reliance on market mechanisms as opposed to other forms of dealing with climate change. It was a shift, as we all know, from the Brundtland Report of the 1980s on sustainable development, which was oriented to much more forms of human development and a range of interventionist policies that were pushing in an egalitarian direction. And the Brundtland Report itself was already a retreat from what were the demands for a new international economic order. So we have this kind of momentum, or have to make an assessment of the failures that have occurred around market ecology, the main way our governments in Canada of all stripes are attempting to deal with ecological questions. There is also, I think, what we were discussing, also a tougher issue that has to be confronted. And that is that these weren't just a matter of advocating policy techniques. This was also a measure of shifting of the political and policy orientation of the big ENGOs, the big environmental groups in Canada. It represented a political shift, a shift to an emphasis on lobbying, an emphasis on professionalization. And from the mid-90s on, rather than being a key node in building social alliances in Canada, building anti-neoliberal politics, they abandoned that political orientation for the most part. And became a mode of kind of trying to find accommodative measures within neoliberal capitalism. Another form of this was again a retreat from confronting the big issues and trying to solve these ecological issues on a micro level towards the turn towards various forms of localism. All things that we might endorse in some way, but they don't really address the kind of main structural pressures that are creating the ecological contradictions that we now face. I think after 3 decades of this movement towards market ecology, we have to be clear that this has been an utter failure. It's been an utter failure in dealing with the ecological crisis. Green capitalism has not provided any solutions in that direction. In fact, if you think about it, particularly when we see so much of the ecology movement, but the states in Canada moving towards cap and trade system, it in fact builds up the political forces, the market mechanisms, the financial instruments that are pushing in the opposite direction. That's what happens when you build up cap and trade financial systems. You build up the power systems, the market mechanisms, the financialization that pushes in the other direction. I think one has to draw a strong conclusion and not evade this. Just as the way social democracy had been shifting and forming a third-way politics in relationship to neoliberal capitalism, this was occurring and has been occurring in the environmental movement. They were as much a part of anything else of these other forces in building the space for this kind of a political turn. I think one has to draw very strong conclusions about its consequences. I cannot forgive, for example, the German Green Party and their moves in this direction, which included kind of their alliances with NATO. They're forming a black-green coalitions. Black-green coalitions with the right, which is also the way that the Green Party largely operates in Canada. It's very difficult to forgive a lot of the way that the Green movement has moved in support of cap and trade and these market mechanisms to deal with ecological crisis at the very point in time when the world is facing so much austerity and attempts to really address ecological issues by building up those very same financial institutions through that mechanism. This political issue, I think, it's not that it was. Many of us were talking about this for a long time as a direction that was going to occur from these developments. We had a group of us here, if you are in the audience, of a meeting in the 1990s that began unpacking the moves that the ecological movement was making towards market mechanisms. We were doing this as part of a group that was working around green work and around ecological theory at York University. It was also part of intellectual criticisms that we were making in the Socialist Register in 2007, the volume we did on coming to terms with nature. It's been a constant theme of monthly review and some of the main ecological socialists, Bellamy Foster, Paul Burkett, and so on, that these would be the consequences of the movement towards market ecology, the acceptance of green capitalism. That is the real point that comes from Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything. The failure of that politics to address, and those kinds of policies to address the climate crisis, but you can take from the climate crisis to almost every other ecological contradiction that exists. That is the conclusion that she came to, and it was what turned her in a more radical direction politically in this book from where some of the solutions and ideas that she'd been putting forward before. I think this takes us in a different direction. I think this puts the question of the ecological struggle at the point in time where we are in general in rethinking the left and rethinking what socialism is and the strategies and political program, political organization that we need to put on the table to think about where we're going. And I think there's we have been developing for a long time period a way to think about those issues and specific programmatic struggles that we're engaged in right now that we need to connect to that larger vision as well. Some of this is, of course, is linked to what many of us discuss in terms of 21st century socialism, the attempt to integrate social ownership, social control, and social needs as a basic framework for thinking about the agenda that we face ahead. And I think there's a lot of ideas that follow from that we need to keep in mind. And some of those themes are ones that have come from the feminist movement in the 1970s and 80s. It was part of the ecological movement in the 1970s as it was emerging, part of the anti-racist movement, and so on. I think it's worthwhile just to list a few of those themes, the way that we have to think about alternatives. Clearly, one of the main things that we have to do is a struggle to increase the scale and scope of democracy and decrease the scale of private market transactions. That has to be the kind of bottom line approach to dealing with alternatives. And the problem that we faced in market ecology is kind of reverse that, right? It's been a reverse of that foundational orientation. We have to think about an egalitarian distribution of economic output. The way that we think across time, across people, across space, in dealing with the output that's produced. Thirdly, we have to be focused on forming ecologically responsible, quality-intensive, skill-enriching forms of economic development. We have to focus on the democratization. This is the key issue, not just the democratization of ownership structures, but the democratization of administration. That is how we run the productive organizations, how we run the state. We have to kind of take on the question of the democratization of administration as well as production. These involved in a number of relative specific issues: controls over capital flows, the question over increasing the proportion of output that passes through the state so we could expand meeting social need, the increasing forms of planning and control over the investment so we can kind of undertake an energy transition, specifying rights to human development, specifying rights to collective consumption and leisure, and so forth. These are kind of the general political, social orientation to reforming a democratic socialist politics that we've had for some time. But it's not connecting so well with the range of struggles that exist. But if you see, you can see a lot of struggles that are can be framed in that way that follow from those premises. Let's just think, for example, of the question of green work, or the question of the energy transition. It's quite possible for us, in thinking about a transition to green work and the energy transition that's necessary, to think of the different ways that we can promote green jobs and a low carbon usage development. Now, if we're doing it from this perspective, we begin particularly from a focus on dirty jobs, and dirty jobs that are often poorly paid. And it orients us to a particular way of kind of collective organization, unionization, raising questions of wages and so on. That can be expanded in any number of others: retrofitting, transport, energy transition, environmental cleanup, and so on. All those things that we completely failed in Canada to have take place during the period we had the meeting of the crisis in 2008 to 2011, that emergency spending. We just weren't prepared to undertake any of that. We also, in thinking about green work, can make a linkage to integration of some of these demands in collective bargaining. We can demand our unions start forming energy committees to monitor and address the carbon footprints of the enterprises we work in. We can negotiate very concrete demands around a just transition of what happens with the displacement of work from the energy transition and so on. So there's ways that we can kind of focus on ecological issues, make them part of our union struggles, and have a different kind of orientation to dealing with alternatives and the green transition. And it's possible to kind of expand this in any number of ways. I was speaking already a little bit about the alternative that were possible during the crisis, and given that we're still in a period of having to think through anti-austerity policies and programs, there's a lot that we can still emphasize in terms of a Green New Deal. Some of this has to do with the way that we source and just use public purchasing power. Some of this has to do with green conversion projects. Some of this has to do with the way that we can use the state and have to use the state to for a transition out of fossil fuels. There's any number of ways that we can expand that. The critical thing, though, I think, is not simply demanding a Green New Deal vis-a-vis the expenditures on low-carbon sectors. They're shifting expenditures and energy towards low-carbon sectors. It's also connecting that demand and that vision to many of the traditional demands of the left. Many of the traditional demands of the left, the feminist movement, the anti-racist movement, the workers' movement, are anti-greenhouse gas demands. And we have to make those central. And one of the tragedies of the turn of the environmental movement to market ecology is, in fact, they dropped all these kinds of demands. You can look at pretty much all their platforms and position papers, and they almost say nothing about these kinds of demands. These are such things as the expansion of collective services, parks, museums, childcare, elder care, libraries, etc. All those are egalitarian demands, but they're also low carbon areas of expending our collective output. The expansion of free education. Obviously, the expansion of free public transit, one of the campaigns that many of us are engaged with in Free Transit Toronto. Environmental cleanup. The redistribution of income in itself is a demand that is a low carbon emissions demand given the class distribution of carbon emissions. The capital controls and managed trade, the traditional demand of the left, is a low carbon emissions demand. So we have to kind of go from those focused just on moving out of the fossil industry to those demands that are also part of the program of the left, that deals with collective ownership, democracy, egalitarian production, are also demands that have to be embedded in the environmental movement. There is a range of things that we also have to concretely think about in terms of connecting our ecological demands to anti-capitalist demands. And that obviously, in Canada, this is the critical demands and how we raise them in terms of the tar sands struggle, which has to connect up to these demands. Some of the specific things that we can emphasize, the transitional demands in dealing with the tar sands, are a bit obvious and have been emerging out of the tar sands struggles. These are no more approvals of tar sands development, this absolute constraint that should be our base demand right now that we can win. The phase out of existing high emissions tar sands, basically what much of the pipeline struggles are about. Thirdly, the phase out of coal-fired energy plants, again, a demand that we can win right now. The increasing energy intensity and alternative energy developments that we can push. The taxation on carbon and other emissions that we can win. And our insistence that the putting forward of carbon taxes not be done in a revenue neutral way, as it's been done in British Columbia, but it has to be a way that we expand public revenues to be targeted into collective consumption, public transportation, and so on. And finally, I think where this connects with the wider traditional socialist demands is we have to maintain and move towards public ownership of energy. And we are in a major struggle right now in this province around the privatization of that. The privatization of that will build up further the financial interests and so on, which are absolutely moving in an anti-ecological direction. It's a fundamental demand if we want to address and move in towards a low-carbon, anti-fossil fuel orientation that we stop that privatization. It's essential. That is having public ownership and democratizing that public ownership is absolutely essential to a movement towards a low-carbon emission strategy. To conclude, I think we are not in a very good position right now in Canada in terms of these struggles. Where we're at. If we look at the weight of balance of forces in Canada, they are largely moving in a negative direction. Where social democracy is positioned in Canada is largely consistent with market ecology and the extractivist orientation of the Canadian model development. The Green Parties in Canada, the Green Party has as its number one position, right? Its number one positions on how to deal with the green transition is to get the prices right. Right? That's its number one demand. And from that, it does say some very good things here and there, but that's the kind of political orientation it's taking us to. The big NGOs in Canada are starting to rethink some of their orientations to market ecology. How can they not, after the reflection of the 30 years of disaster, that thinking of getting the prices right alone will solve these problems? But we have to keep putting pressure in that direction. We have to keep putting pressure that those NGOs return to a range of the civil disobedience, the militancy that they had in the 1980s when we were stopping the deforestation of the old growth forest. We have to move in that direction. you know, we have to continue to develop the kind of individual campaigns that we've been generating that have been quite good around shale fracking. Some of the fights around the boreal forest, particularly being led by the Aboriginal peoples who particularly live in the boreal forest, around the oceans and fisheries. And we have to develop and continue to develop some of the successful conjunctural alliances that have been forming around the tar sands fight, which Nilüfer was just speaking about. Those are the very positive developments in a way that we can start demonstrating an alternative approach to these issues. But I think we can't forget that there's a lot that we have to also give up before we can move on. We have to give up completely the notion that market ecology or getting the prices right is going to be able to deal with the ecological contradictions that exist. We have to give up the notion that social democracy will become the basis of an anti-capitalist or even a radically redistributional program. We have to give up the notion that the various political parties and programs that came out in 1917 are adequate to the politics of today. All the post-politics that still circulate, particularly in Toronto around political groupings here, that is not the world or the political program or organization that we're going to be able to address the politics today. And most of all, I think we have to give up the fatalism that we've been living in. The fatalism that we can't build from specific programmatic campaigns to wider projects, from wider projects to new political organizations, from new political organization to the return of revolutionary ambitions. And from revolutionary ambitions, I think what Naomi Klein absolutely gets right, that we need to change everything. Thank you.